My name is Rachel Thompson, and at 28 years old, I never imagined 3 simple words would destroy my relationship with my mother forever. "You're being selfish," she said, her voice dripping with disappointment as she stood in my apartment doorway, holding the key I'd just asked her to return. The silence that followed felt like a chasm opening between us. 28 years of complicated love suddenly reduced to this moment of accusation and hurt. Looking for more. We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads. I stood there in my modest 1-bedroom apartment in downtown Portland, Oregon, watching the woman who raised me transform into someone I barely recognized. Margaret Thompson, with her perfectly coiffed silver hair and designer cardigan, clutched her purse like a shield as she delivered those words that would echo in my mind for months to come. Little did either of us know that my upcoming therapy appointment would validate everything I'd been feeling and change our family dynamic forever. Growing up as the only child of Margaret and David Thompson meant living under a microscope of expectations and emotional manipulation disguised as love. My father, a quiet accountant who worked long hours at his firm downtown, seemed to fade into the background whenever my mother's intensity filled a room. He'd retreat behind his newspaper or find urgent tasks in the garage, leaving me to navigate the complex emotional terrain of being Margaret's sole focus and greatest project. Our house on Elm Street in the suburbs of Portland was a testament to my mother's need for control and perfection. Every surface gleamed, every decoration was precisely placed, and every routine was sacred. Breakfast at 7:30 sharp, homework completed at the dining room table under her watchful eye, bedtime stories that somehow always contained lessons about obedience and gratitude. The house felt more like a museum than a home, where spilled juice was a catastrophe and muddy shoes were evidence of moral failing. Margaret had a particular way of making me feel simultaneously special and trapped. She'd tell neighbors how mature I was for my age, how responsible and thoughtful, but these compliments always came with strings attached. My maturity meant I should understand why she needed to know where I was every moment. My responsibility meant I should anticipate her needs before she expressed them. My thoughtfulness meant I should consider her feelings above my own in every situation. School became my sanctuary, the only place where I could exist without constant scrutiny and commentary. Teachers praised my creativity and independence, qualities that seemed to worry my mother rather than please her. When I excelled in art class, she worried I was becoming too dreamy and impractical. When I joined the debate team, she fretted that I was becoming argumentative and difficult. Success outside her direct influence was somehow threatening to the carefully constructed world she'd built around us. My father existed on the periphery of our intense relationship, occasionally offering gentle suggestions that were quickly overruled or ignored. He worked late most evenings, claiming deadline pressures, though I suspected he simply preferred the quiet efficiency of his office to the emotional complexity of our home. When he was present, he seemed almost apologetic, as if his very existence was an inconvenience to the delicate balance my mother maintained. Friendships proved challenging under my mother's watchful eye. Playdates required extensive background checks on the other families, and sleepovers were rare privileges that could be revoked for the slightest infraction. My mother had strong opinions about which friends were suitable influences and which posed risks to my development. She had an uncanny ability to find fault with any child or family that might provide me with alternative perspectives on how relationships should function. By high school, I'd learned to navigate her expectations with careful precision. I dated boys she approved of, chose activities that enhanced rather than challenged her vision of who I should become, and shared my dreams only when they aligned with her plans for my future. The few times I attempted to assert independence resulted in tearful lectures about ingratitude and selfishness, followed by days of cold silence that felt more punishing than any direct confrontation. College represented my first real taste of Freedom, though even from 3 hours away in Eugene, my mother's influence loomed large. Daily phone calls were expected, weekend visits were assumed, and major decisions still required her input and approval. I chose a practical major in business administration rather than pursuing my passion for graphic design, convincing myself that stability mattered more than creativity. My mother's relief when I announced this decision was so palpable that I almost believed I'd made the right choice. Living in the dorms provided glimpses of how other families functioned, and these observations were both enlightening and disturbing. My roommate Sarah spoke to her parents once a week, made her own decisions about classes and activities, and seemed genuinely excited to share her life rather than obligated to report it. When Sarah's mother visited, she asked questions out of curiosity rather than conducting interrogations, and she offered advice only when solicited. The contrast became even starker when I met my college boyfriend, Marcus Williams, whose family operated with a warmth and respect that felt foreign to me. Marcus could disagree with his parents without triggering emotional warfare. He could change plans without lengthy explanations or guilt-inducing lectures. His mother, Linda Williams, treated me with genuine interest rather than viewing me as an extension of her son's choices. Their family dinners buzzed with conversation where different opinions were welcomed rather than threats to be neutralized. After graduation, I moved back home temporarily while job hunting, and the transition felt suffocating after 4 years of relative independence. My mother had converted my childhood bedroom into a craft room, but quickly restored it when I announced my return, treating this reversal as evidence of her superior planning and my poor decision-making. Every job application was scrutinized. Every interview outfit required her approval, and every potential position was evaluated based on how it would reflect on our family, rather than whether it aligned with my interests or goals. The job I finally accepted at a mid-sized marketing firm downtown represented a compromise between my creative interests and her desire for stability. But even this success became another opportunity for her to demonstrate her indispensability. She offered to help me apartment hunt, insisted on co-signing my lease, and volunteered to help furnish my new space according to her taste and standards. Each gesture of support came wrapped in subtle reminders of my dependence and her sacrifice. Moving into my own apartment should have been exciting, but my mother's involvement turned it into an extension of her domain rather than the beginning of my independence. She had keys, of course, for emergencies and convenience. She knew my schedule better than I did, often arriving with groceries or cleaning supplies when she determined I needed them. My refrigerator was stocked according to her meal plans, my closet organized according to her system, and my social calendar monitored for suitable activities and appropriate companions. The marketing firm proved to be an interesting environment, where I slowly began to recognize my own abilities and preferences, separate from my mother's expectations. My supervisor, Jennifer Martinez, was a woman in her 40s who had built her career on creative campaigns and strategic thinking. She encouraged bold ideas and independent problem-solving, creating a work environment where my natural creativity began to flourish despite years of careful suppression. My colleagues came from diverse backgrounds and brought different perspectives to our projects, exposing me to ways of thinking that had been carefully filtered out of my previous experiences. During lunch conversations, I heard stories about family dynamics that ranged from supportive to challenging, but most seemed to involve more mutual respect and less emotional manipulation than what I'd known growing up. These conversations planted seeds of doubt about whether my mother's behavior was as normal and loving as I'd been taught to believe. The first major conflict arose when I was offered the opportunity to work on a high-profile campaign that would require occasional travel and longer hours. The project represented everything I'd hoped for professionally, combining creative challenge with significant career advancement potential. When I excitedly shared this news with my mother, her response was immediate concern about how this would affect our relationship and her access to my time and attention. She worried about my safety traveling alone, questioned whether the additional responsibility was worth the stress, and suggested that perhaps I was being too ambitious too quickly. Her concerns were presented as loving protection, but they felt like attempts to keep me small and manageable. When I decided to accept the opportunity. Despite her reservations, her disappointment was palpable, and her support conspicuously absent. The success of that first major project gave me confidence I'd never experienced before, and this confidence began to spill over into other areas of my life. I started making decisions based on my own judgment rather than anticipating her approval. I began to recognize the difference between love that supports growth and attention that requires compliance. Most importantly, I started to understand that having needs and boundaries didn't make me selfish or ungrateful. The turning point came on a rainy Thursday evening in October, when I returned from work to find my mother in my apartment, rearranging my kitchen cabinets according to what she considered a more logical system. She'd used her key to enter while I was at work, spending hours reorganizing my space to meet her standards. When I walked through the door, tired from a long day of meetings and looking forward to the quiet sanctuary of my own space, I found her elbow deep in my personal belongings with a satisfied smile on her face. The sight of her standing in my kitchen, surrounded by my possessions arranged according to her preferences, triggered something I'd never felt before. Not anger exactly, but a deep recognition that this wasn't normal or healthy or sustainable. This was my space, my apartment, my adult life. And her presence there without invitation or permission represented everything that had felt wrong about our relationship for as long as I could remember. When I asked her why she was there, she explained with genuine confusion that she'd noticed my spice rack was disorganized during her last visit and wanted to help me fix it before it became a real problem. She'd also taken the liberty of throwing away food she considered expired, restocking my refrigerator with items she thought I needed, and reorganizing my bathroom cabinets for better efficiency. All of this was presented as thoughtful assistance, evidence of her care and concern for my well-being. Standing there in my own apartment, watching my mother explain why my space needed her intervention, I finally understood what my college friends had meant when they talked about boundaries. This wasn't help. This wasn't love. This was control disguised as care, and it had shaped every aspect of our relationship since birth. The realization hit me with such clarity that I felt almost dizzy, as if I'd been living in a fog that suddenly lifted to reveal the landscape I'd been navigating blindly for 28 years. That evening, after asking my mother to leave my apartment and watching her drive away with wounded confusion written across her face, I sat alone in my kitchen surrounded by the evidence of her uninvited presence. The spice rack she'd reorganized according to alphabetical order rather than my preferred system of frequency of use. The refrigerator stocked with organic vegetables I didn't particularly enjoy, but she considered essential for proper nutrition. The bathroom medicine cabinet where she'd discarded perfectly good products and replaced them with brands she trusted more. Each change represented hours of her time and effort, genuine care expressed through action, yet sitting in that space felt like inhabiting someone else's life rather than my own. The apartment that had briefly represented independence now felt like an extension of the childhood home I'd never quite escaped. For the first time in my adult life, I began to question whether this level of involvement was actually normal, whether other mothers possessed keys to their adult children's apartments and felt entitled to use them whenever concern struck. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now back to where we left off. My relationship with work became increasingly important as I realized it was the one area of my life where my mother's influence couldn't penetrate directly. Jennifer Martinez had quickly recognized my potential and began assigning me to more challenging projects that required creative problem-solving and independent thinking. The marketing campaigns I developed drew positive responses from clients and colleagues alike, building a professional identity that existed separately from my role as Margaret Thompson's daughter. The travel opportunities that came with increased responsibility proved particularly valuable, not because they took me away from my mother, but because they exposed me to different ways of living and thinking. Business trips to Seattle, San Francisco, and Denver introduced me to colleagues who spoke casually about their family relationships, without the underlying tension that characterized my own experiences. They mentioned visiting parents on holidays, rather than weekly obligations, phone calls that happened organically rather than on strict schedules. During a particularly successful campaign launch in Seattle, I found myself at a celebratory dinner with the client team, listening to stories about their personal lives with fascination and growing discomfort. Maria Santos, the client's creative director, mentioned how her mother had initially worried about her moving across the country for college, but had ultimately supported her decision because she recognized Maria's need for independence. The way Maria described this as unremarkable, even expected, made me realize how unusual my own experience had been. Another colleague, David Chen, talked about setting boundaries with his well-meaning parents when they tried to influence his career decisions. After graduation, he explained how he'd had to have difficult conversations about respecting his choices while still maintaining a loving relationship. The fact that he could disagree with his parents without triggering emotional crisis seemed almost miraculous to me. More importantly, the way his colleagues received this story as perfectly normal, rather than evidence of ingratitude or selfishness, challenged everything I'd been taught about family loyalty. These conversations planted seeds of doubt that grew stronger each time. I returned home to Portland and resumed the familiar patterns of my relationship with my mother. The weekly dinner invitations that weren't really invitations but expectations. The concerned phone calls when I didn't respond to texts within her preferred time frame. The subtle criticism disguised as helpful suggestions about everything from my career choices to my appearance to my social activities. My relationship with my father remained frustratingly peripheral throughout this period of growing awareness. David Thompson had perfected the art of emotional absence while physically present, nodding along with my mother's concerns without offering his own perspective or support. When I occasionally tried to engage him directly about family dynamics, he would deflect with comments about my mother's good intentions or change the subject to safer topics like my work or the weather. The few times I attempted to discuss my growing need for space and independence, my father would listen with apparent sympathy before suggesting that perhaps I was being too sensitive or expecting too much. His inability to recognize or validate my concerns left me feeling even more isolated and confused about whether my perceptions were accurate or if I was indeed being unreasonably demanding as my mother suggested. Sunday dinners at my childhood home became increasingly difficult to endure as my awareness grew. The rituals that had once felt like loving traditions now revealed themselves as mechanisms of control and manipulation. My mother would prepare elaborate meals that required hours of preparation, then use this sacrifice as evidence of her devotion and my corresponding obligation. Any attempt to limit these gatherings or suggest alternative arrangements was met with hurt confusion about my apparent lack of appreciation for family time. The conversations during these dinners followed predictable patterns that I began to recognize with uncomfortable clarity. My mother would ask detailed questions about my work, my apartment, my social activities, presenting this interrogation as loving interest while using the information to offer unsolicited advice and subtle criticism. My successes were praised but somehow diminished. My challenges were highlighted as evidence that I needed more guidance and support. My father's role during these dinners was to provide occasional supportive murmurs while avoiding any topic that might create conflict or require him to take a position that differed from my mother's. He had developed an impressive ability to seem engaged while remaining completely neutral, leaving me to navigate the emotional complexity of these interactions without any backup or alternative perspective. The isolation I felt during this period was profound and confusing. My colleagues saw me as competent and independent, my professional life was thriving, yet in my family context I felt like a child who couldn't be trusted to make appropriate decisions about my own life. The disconnect between these two versions of myself was exhausting, and made me question my own judgment about which one was more accurate. My attempts to establish small boundaries were met with such dramatic responses that I began to doubt whether I was being reasonable. When I asked my mother to call before visiting my apartment rather than using her key, she became tearful and accused me of shutting her out after everything she'd done for me. When I suggested we reduce our dinner frequency from weekly to bi-weekly, she wondered aloud what she had done wrong to deserve such rejection from her only child. These reactions were so intense and emotionally charged that I found myself backing down and apologizing for having needs that apparently caused her such pain. The pattern became exhausting. I would recognize something that felt wrong, attempt to address it gently, face an overwhelming emotional response, then retreat and accept the status quo while questioning my own perceptions and motivations. The turning point began during a particularly challenging week at work when I was managing multiple deadlines while preparing for an important client presentation. My stress levels were high. My apartment had become a workspace covered with campaign materials and research, and I was surviving on takeout food and minimal sleep. When my mother arrived unannounced on Wednesday evening with homemade dinner and cleaning supplies, her presence felt like an invasion rather than assistance. She immediately began commenting on the state of my apartment, the unhealthy food containers in my trash, my appearance, and my apparent inability to maintain proper self-care while working. Her criticism was delivered with loving concern, but it felt like salt in wounds I was already struggling to manage. When I suggested that perhaps this wasn't the best time for a visit, she became hurt and defensive, pointing out that she was trying to help and didn't understand why I was being so ungrateful. The argument that followed was unlike any we'd had before because for the first time I didn't back down when faced with her emotional reaction. Instead of apologizing and accepting her version of events, I continued to insist that showing up uninvited when I was clearly overwhelmed wasn't helpful, regardless of her intentions. This persistence on my part seemed to shock her into an even more intense response, including tears, accusations of selfishness, and threats to stop trying to help me altogether. My father's response when she called him for support was predictably disappointing. He listened to her tearful account of my ungrateful behavior, then called me to suggest that perhaps I should apologize for hurting her feelings. When I tried to explain my perspective, he interrupted to remind me how much my mother loved me and how hard she worked to support me. The conversation ended with his gentle but firm suggestion that I should consider whether my work stress was making me unreasonably difficult. The aftermath of this confrontation left me feeling more isolated than ever, but also strangely empowered. For the first time, I had stood my ground in the face of my mother's emotional manipulation, and while the experience had been unpleasant, I had survived it. More importantly, I had articulated my own needs clearly and refused to accept responsibility for her reaction to those needs. This experience coincided with several conversations at work that provided additional perspective on family relationships and boundary setting. Jennifer Martinez mentioned her own struggles with an overbearing mother during her 20s, describing how she'd had to learn to separate love from control and establish clear limits on her mother's involvement in her adult life. She spoke about this process with matter-of-fact acceptance, presenting it as a normal part of growing up rather than evidence of family dysfunction. Another colleague, Robert Kim, shared his experience of moving across the country specifically to create physical distance from his family's emotional intensity. He described the guilt and difficulty of this decision, but also the relief and personal growth that had resulted from having space to develop his own identity and decision-making processes. His story resonated deeply with my own situation and helped normalize the feelings of suffocation and confusion I'd been experiencing. These conversations, combined with my recent confrontation with my mother, created a growing sense that perhaps the problem wasn't my sensitivity or ingratitude, but rather the fundamental dynamics of our relationship. The idea that I might not be responsible for managing my mother's emotions or sacrificing my own needs to avoid her discomfort began to seem possible, even reasonable. The decision to seek professional help came gradually, born from a combination of exhaustion, confusion, and a growing sense that I needed an objective perspective on my family situation. I had never considered therapy before, viewing it as something for people with serious mental health issues rather than garden-variety family problems. However, the intensity of my mother's reactions to my attempts at independence, combined with my father's complete inability to provide support or perspective, left me feeling like I needed guidance from someone outside the situation. Finding a therapist proved more challenging than I'd expected, both practically and emotionally. The process of researching providers, checking insurance coverage, and scheduling appointments felt like admitting that I couldn't handle my own problems. My mother's voice echoed in my head, questioning whether I was being overly dramatic and whether professional help was really necessary for what seemed like normal family tensions. The therapist I eventually chose, Dr. Patricia Hernandez, specialized in family dynamics and young adult transition issues. Her office was located in a professional building downtown, close enough to my workplace that I could schedule appointments during my lunch hour without drawing attention or requiring explanations to my mother about my whereabouts. This practical consideration felt important as I wasn't ready to discuss my decision to seek therapy with anyone in my family. The week leading up to my first appointment was filled with anxiety and second-guessing. I worried that I was wasting the therapist's time with problems that weren't serious enough to warrant professional attention. I feared that she would agree with my mother's assessment that I was being selfish and ungrateful. Most troubling of all, I worried that she might confirm my deepest fear, that I was fundamentally flawed in some way that made normal family relationships impossible for me to maintain. The weeks following my decision to seek therapy brought an unexpected escalation in my mother's behavior that made me question whether she somehow sensed my growing independence. Her visits to my apartment became more frequent and less predictable, often timed to coincide with moments when I was most vulnerable or stressed. She would appear with groceries during my busiest work periods, arrive unannounced when I was dealing with personal challenges, and somehow always manage to insert herself into situations where her absence would have been more helpful than her presence. The key incident that crystallized my understanding of our dysfunctional dynamic occurred on a Saturday morning in late November when I had planned a rare weekend of complete solitude. After weeks of demanding projects and social obligations, I had deliberately cleared my schedule to catch up on sleep, organize my apartment according to my own preferences, and simply exist without external demands or expectations. I had specifically mentioned to my mother during our weekly phone call that I was looking forward to a quiet weekend alone. Saturday morning arrived with the promise of rain and the luxury of sleeping past my usual alarm. I woke naturally around 9, made coffee, according to my own timeline, and was settling in with a book when my mother's key turned in the lock. She entered carrying bags from the organic market, cleaning supplies, and an expression of determined helpfulness that I was beginning to recognize as a warning sign of impending boundary violations. Her explanation for this uninvited intrusion was characteristically wrapped in language of care and concern. She had worried that I wasn't eating properly based on some comment I'd made about surviving on takeout during a busy week, so she had taken it upon herself to stock my refrigerator with healthy options and prepare several meals I could freeze for future convenience. The fact that I had explicitly stated my desire for solitude was somehow reframed as evidence that I needed her intervention more than ever. The conversation that followed revealed the depth of her inability to respect my autonomy as an adult. When I gently suggested that she should have called first, she responded with genuine confusion about why this would be necessary since she was only trying to help. When I explained that her help, while appreciated, wasn't always wanted or needed, she became visibly hurt and began questioning whether I no longer valued our close relationship. My attempt to establish a clear boundary about future visits requiring advance notice triggered an emotional response so intense that I momentarily doubted my own reasonableness. She began crying, Not the manipulative tears I might have expected, but seemingly genuine distress at the suggestion that her spontaneous care was somehow inappropriate. Her pain appeared so authentic that I found myself caught between my own need for space and her apparent need to express love through constant involvement. The pattern that emerged from this confrontation became a template for our subsequent interactions. Any attempt on my part to assert independence or establish boundaries was met with emotional intensity that reframed my needs as attacks on her identity as a loving mother. Her responses were so disproportionate to my requests that I began to question whether I was being unreasonably demanding or whether her reactions were themselves the problem. My father's role during this period became increasingly frustrating, as I recognized his pattern of conflict avoidance and emotional abandonment. When I called him later that day to discuss the morning's events, he listened with apparent sympathy before delivering his usual counsel about my mother's good intentions and the importance of family harmony. His inability to acknowledge that good intentions didn't justify boundary violations left me feeling completely alone in recognizing the unhealthy dynamics of our family system. The workplace provided an increasingly stark contrast to the emotional chaos of my family relationships. Jennifer Martinez had promoted me to senior associate, recognizing my ability to manage complex campaigns and lead creative teams. My colleagues respected my judgment, valued my input, and treated me as a competent professional capable of making informed decisions about my own work and career. The disconnect between this professional identity and my role as Margaret Thompson's perpetually incompetent daughter became impossible to ignore. During a particularly successful campaign presentation in early December, I found myself confidently fielding questions from senior executives, making strategic recommendations, and demonstrating expertise that had developed through experience and professional growth. The contrast between this version of myself and the uncertain, constantly second-guessing person I became in family situations was striking and troubling. How could I be trusted to manage million-dollar marketing budgets but apparently incapable of organizing my own spice rack properly? The holiday season brought these tensions to a crescendo as my mother's involvement in every aspect of my life intensified under the guise of Christmas preparations. She volunteered to help me shop for gifts, insisting that her experience and connections would ensure I chose appropriate presents for everyone on my list. She offered to host our traditional Christmas Eve gathering, but insisted on having it catered by her preferred vendor rather than allowing me to contribute dishes I might actually enjoy preparing. Each offer of help came with detailed instructions, subtle corrections, and implied criticism of my previous choices or capabilities. My suggestion that I might prefer to handle my own holiday preparations was met with hurt confusion about why I would reject her generous offers of assistance. Her ability to reframe my desire for autonomy as rejection of her love was so skillful that I began to doubt my own motivations and wonder if I was indeed being selfish and ungrateful. The Christmas shopping expedition she insisted on became a masterclass in passive-aggressive control disguised as helpful guidance. Every item I selected was subjected to careful evaluation, with gentle suggestions that perhaps something else might be more appropriate, more practical, or better received. Her criticism was never direct enough to argue against, but persistent, enough to undermine my confidence in my own judgment and leave me feeling incompetent and dependent. My attempts to purchase gifts independently were somehow sabotaged by her superior knowledge of everyone's preferences, her connections with better stores, or her ability to secure discounts I couldn't access on my own. By the end of the day, I had spent significantly more money than intended on items I hadn't originally chosen, while listening to my mother's gentle lectures about the importance of thoughtful gift-giving and the complexity of maintaining family relationships. The Christmas Eve gathering itself became a performance of family harmony that felt increasingly artificial and strained. My mother had orchestrated every detail according to her vision of perfect holiday celebration, from the catered menu I didn't particularly enjoy to the scheduled activities that left no room for spontaneous conversation or relaxation. My role was to appear grateful and engaged while suppressing any preferences that might disrupt her carefully planned event. My cousins and aunts praised my mother's hostess skills and organizational abilities, commenting on how lucky I was to have such a devoted parent who took care of every detail. Their well-meaning compliments felt like additional pressure to appreciate arrangements I hadn't requested and didn't necessarily enjoy. My father played his usual role of supportive background presence, nodding approvingly at my mother's efforts while avoiding any involvement that might require actual decision-making or conflict resolution. The conversation during dinner inevitably turned to my career success and independent living situation, topics that my mother managed to discuss in ways that simultaneously praised my achievements and highlighted my continued need for her guidance and support. She spoke proudly of my professional accomplishments while mentioning her ongoing concerns about my work-life balance, my apartment maintenance, and my social relationships. Her ability to express pride while communicating worry created a complex, emotional dynamic that left me feeling simultaneously celebrated and infantilized. Every success was tempered with reminders of potential problems. Every sign of independence was balanced with evidence of my continued dependence on her wisdom and care. The overall message was clear. I was doing well, but only because of her continued involvement, and any reduction in that involvement would inevitably lead to problems I was apparently incapable of handling alone. The evening concluded with my mother's traditional emotional speech about the importance of family and her gratitude for our close relationship. Her words were heartfelt and genuine, expressing real love and appreciation for our bond, yet they felt like chains disguised as jewelry. Her love was real, but it was love that required my compliance with her vision of who I should be and how our relationship should function. The week between Christmas and New Year brought an unexpected crisis that highlighted the extent to which my mother's involvement had become problematic. A water leak in my apartment building required temporary relocation while repairs were completed, and my mother immediately offered to have me stay in my childhood bedroom until the situation was resolved. Her offer was generous and practical, yet the prospect of returning to that space filled me with anxiety that seemed disproportionate to the circumstances. The 3 days I spent in my childhood home were revelatory in their demonstration of how quickly I reverted to old patterns of behavior and thinking. Within hours of arrival, I found myself seeking my mother's approval for basic decisions, apologizing for inconveniences I hadn't caused, and accepting her management of my daily routine without question. The independent, competent professional I had become seemed to dissolve in the face of familiar environment and established family dynamics. My mother's delight at having me home was obvious and touching, yet it also revealed the extent to which my independence threatened her sense of purpose and identity. She threw herself into caring for me with an intensity that would have been appropriate for someone who was ill or incapacitated, not a temporarily displaced adult. Her need to be needed was so profound that my self-sufficiency seemed to cause her genuine distress. The return to my repaired apartment after 3 days felt like emerging from underwater, and the relief I experienced at being in my own space again was so intense that it forced me to confront the reality of my family situation. The fact that staying with my loving, well-intentioned mother felt like suffocation rather than comfort was a clear indication that something fundamental was wrong with our relationship dynamic. My first therapy appointment was scheduled for the second week of January, and as the date approached, my anxiety intensified. I had never spoken about my family situation with anyone outside the system, never articulated my concerns to a neutral party, never questioned whether my perceptions were accurate or fair. The prospect of describing my relationship with my mother to a stranger felt simultaneously terrifying and necessary. The days leading up to the appointment were marked by increased tension with my mother, as if she somehow sensed that I was preparing to seek outside perspective on our relationship. Her calls became more frequent, her visits more intrusive, and her emotional neediness more intense. When I mentioned casually that I had been feeling stressed lately, she immediately offered to help me find a doctor who could prescribe something to help me relax, dismissing the possibility that the stress might be situational rather than medical. Her suggestion that my discomfort with our relationship dynamic was a medical problem rather than a legitimate response to boundary violations was the final confirmation I needed that seeking professional guidance was not only appropriate, but essential. The fact that she couldn't even consider that her behavior might be contributing to my stress revealed the depth of her inability to see me as a separate person with valid needs and perspectives. The night before my first therapy appointment, I lay awake reviewing the events of recent months and trying to organize my thoughts into coherent explanations that wouldn't sound like the complaints of an ungrateful daughter. The challenge of distinguishing between normal family closeness and unhealthy enmeshment seemed almost impossible from my position inside the relationship. I could only hope that Dr. Hernandez would help me understand whether my perceptions were accurate or whether I needed to adjust my expectations and accept my mother's involvement as evidence of love rather than control. As I drifted off to sleep, I wondered if other people struggled with similar confusion about family relationships, or if the clarity my colleagues seemed to have about boundaries and independence came naturally to those raised in healthier systems. Tomorrow's appointment would begin to answer these questions and hopefully provide the perspective I desperately needed to navigate my relationship with my mother in a way that honored both her love and my need for autonomy. Dr. Patricia Hernandez's office occupied a corner suite on the third floor of a modern professional building, with large windows overlooking a small courtyard garden that provided a sense of tranquility despite the urban setting. The waiting room was decorated in calming earth tones with comfortable seating and soft lighting that immediately helped ease my nervousness. When she emerged to greet me for our first appointment, Dr. Hernandez appeared to be in her late 40s, with graying brown hair pulled back in a simple ponytail and warm brown eyes that conveyed both professionalism and genuine compassion. Her office was spacious, but not intimidating, with 2 comfortable chairs positioned at angles that allowed for easy conversation without feeling confrontational. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with professional texts on family systems, trauma recovery, and developmental psychology. A small side table held a box of tissues and a water pitcher with glasses, practical touches that suggested she was accustomed to emotionally difficult conversations. Dr. Hernandez began our session by explaining her approach to therapy and the confidentiality protections that would govern our work together. Her manner was professional but warm, establishing clear boundaries around our therapeutic relationship while creating space for honest exploration of difficult topics. When she asked what had brought me to seek therapy, I found myself struggling to articulate concerns that had felt overwhelming in my daily life, but suddenly seemed trivial when spoken aloud. My initial explanation focused on stress and confusion about my relationship with my mother, describing our interactions in terms that made my mother sound caring but perhaps overly involved. I found myself defending her intentions while expressing frustration with her behavior, creating a narrative that painted me as ungrateful rather than legitimately concerned. Dr. Hernandez listened without interruption, occasionally nodding or making brief notes, but her expression remained neutral and non-judgmental. When I finished my initial description, she asked several clarifying questions that helped illuminate patterns I hadn't fully recognized. How long had my mother been using her key to enter my apartment without permission? When had I begun to feel anxious about spending time alone with her? What happened when I tried to express disagreement with her opinions or preferences? Her questions were gentle but probing, designed to help me examine the dynamics I had been accepting as normal. The breakthrough moment came when Dr. Hernandez asked me to describe a typical interaction with my mother from start to finish, including my emotional responses at each stage. As I walked through the previous weekend's uninvited visit, detailing my mother's arrival, her immediate criticism of my apartment's condition, her reorganization of my belongings, and my eventual capitulation to her vision of how things should be arranged, I began to hear the dysfunction in my own words. Dr. Hernandez's response was measured but illuminating, She explained that healthy adult relationships, including parent-child relationships, were built on mutual respect for autonomy and boundaries. She described how loving parents typically expressed concern and offered support while respecting their adult children's right to make independent decisions, even when those decisions might not align with parental preferences or recommendations. Her clinical explanation of enmeshed family systems felt like someone had finally provided a map for territory I had been navigating blindly for years. She described how some families develop patterns where individual identity becomes subsumed into family identity, where love is conditional on compliance, and where attempts to establish independence are reframed as attacks on family loyalty. Every element of her description resonated with my experience in ways that were both validating and deeply unsettling. When she mentioned that adult children in enmeshed systems often struggle with guilt and confusion when trying to establish appropriate boundaries, I felt tears welling up for the first time in months. The relief of having my experience validated by a professional was overwhelming, but it was accompanied by grief for the years I had spent questioning my own perceptions and accepting responsibility for my mother's emotional reactions to my attempts at independence. Dr. Hernandez explained that my mother's behavior, while motivated by genuine love and concern, crossed important boundaries that healthy relationships require. She described how parents who struggle to respect their adult children's autonomy often have their own unresolved issues with separation and identity, making their children's independence feel like personal rejection or abandonment. This framework helped me understand my mother's intense reactions without accepting responsibility for managing her emotional responses. The session concluded with Dr. Hernandez providing me with several articles about family enmeshment and boundary setting, along with some practical exercises for recognizing and responding to boundary violations. She scheduled our next appointment for the following week and suggested that I begin keeping a journal of my interactions with my mother, noting my emotional responses and the specific behaviors that triggered discomfort or anxiety. Walking 2. My car after that first session, I felt simultaneously lighter and more confused than when I had arrived. The validation of my perceptions was enormously relieving, but the implications of Dr. Hernandez's assessment were daunting. If my relationship with my mother was indeed unhealthy, what did that mean for my future? How could I establish appropriate boundaries with someone who experienced my independence as personal rejection? How could I honor my need for autonomy while maintaining a loving relationship with parents who seemed incapable of respecting that need? The week following my first therapy session brought an unexpected test of my newfound awareness when my mother called on Tuesday evening to inform me that she had scheduled a dentist appointment for me with her preferred dental practice. She had noticed during our last dinner that one of my molars looked like it might be developing a cavity, and rather than suggesting I schedule my own appointment, she had taken the initiative to ensure I received proper care. Her announcement triggered a reaction I hadn't experienced before. Immediate recognition that this was inappropriate boundary crossing rather than helpful assistance. Instead of feeling grateful for her concern or guilty for not having noticed the potential problem, I felt clear anger at her assumption that she could make medical decisions for me without consultation. The contrast between this response and my previous pattern of accepting such interventions was striking and empowering. When I told her that I preferred to handle my own medical appointments and would need to cancel the one she had scheduled, her reaction was swift and predictable. She became tearful and confused, wondering why I was rejecting her help and expressing hurt that I didn't appreciate her proactive care. Her emotional response triggered my old pattern of guilt and self-doubt, but now I had Dr. Hernandez's voice in my head reminding me that boundary violations didn't become appropriate just because they were motivated by love. My attempt to explain why making medical appointments for me without permission was inappropriate led to our first truly direct confrontation about the nature of our relationship. My mother's confusion seemed genuine as she struggled to understand why actions she considered loving and helpful were being redefined as intrusive and controlling. Her inability to see my perspective, even when I explained it clearly and calmly, revealed the depth of her investment in maintaining our dysfunctional dynamic. The conversation ended with my mother's tearful declaration that she was obviously no longer needed or wanted in my life, followed by her abrupt disconnection of the call. This dramatic response to a reasonable request for basic autonomy was so disproportionate that it confirmed everything Dr. Hernandez had explained about enmeshed family systems and emotional manipulation disguised as hurt feelings. My father called within an hour to express concern about my mother's distress and to suggest that perhaps I was being unnecessarily harsh in my rejection of her helpful gesture. His predictable response no longer surprised me, but it did highlight the extent to which our family system was organized around avoiding my mother's emotional discomfort rather than addressing the underlying problems that created that discomfort. When I tried to explain to my father that making medical appointments for adult children without permission wasn't actually helpful, regardless of the intentions behind it, he seemed genuinely confused by my perspective. His suggestion that I should apologize for hurting my mother's feelings revealed his complete inability to recognize that her feelings were hurt because I had refused to accept inappropriate treatment rather than because I had done something wrong. The standoff that followed lasted 3 days, during which my mother maintained radio silence while my father made several attempts to mediate a reconciliation that would restore our previous dynamic. His mediation efforts focused entirely on my mother's hurt feelings and my apparent obligation to repair the damage I had caused by establishing a boundary, with no acknowledgement that her behavior had been inappropriate in the first place. During those 3 days of silence, I experienced a range of emotions that revealed the complexity of extricating myself from an enmeshed system. Relief at the absence of constant monitoring and input was mixed with anxiety about my mother's emotional state and guilt about causing her obvious distress. The programming of 28 years didn't disappear overnight, and I found myself questioning whether my newfound awareness was worth the pain it was causing everyone involved. My second therapy session occurred during this period of family silence, providing an opportunity to process the fallout from my first attempt at direct boundary setting. Dr. Hernandez listened to my account of the dentist appointment incident and its aftermath with professional interest, occasionally asking clarifying questions about my emotional responses and my family's reactions. Her assessment of the situation was both validating and challenging. She confirmed that my mother's behavior was inappropriate and that my response was entirely reasonable. But she also warned me that establishing healthy boundaries with enmeshed family members typically triggers escalating attempts to restore the previous dynamic. She explained that my mother's silence was likely a form of punishment designed to make me so uncomfortable that I would apologize and accept her involvement in my medical care. Dr. Hernandez introduced me to the concept of emotional blackmail, describing how family members sometimes use their own distress as a weapon to control others' behavior. She helped me understand that my mother's tears and hurt feelings were real, but that they didn't make her behavior appropriate or create an obligation for me to sacrifice my autonomy to avoid causing her discomfort. The session included practical guidance for navigating the ongoing standoff with my mother, including scripts for conversations that acknowledged her feelings while maintaining my boundaries. Dr. Hernandez emphasized that healthy relationships required both parties to respect each other's autonomy and that my mother's inability to accept my boundaries was her problem to solve, not mine to accommodate. She also warned me that my attempts to establish healthy boundaries would likely trigger increased pressure from my father and other family members who were invested in maintaining the status quo. She explained that family systems resist change, even positive change, and that I should expect attempts to make me responsible for fixing the problems my boundary setting had revealed. The conversation that finally broke the 3-day silence came when my mother called on Friday evening, ostensibly to apologize for overreacting, but actually to deliver a more sophisticated version of her previous emotional manipulation. She acknowledged that perhaps she should have asked before scheduling my appointment, but she explained that she had been so worried about my dental health that she had acted impulsively out of love and concern. Her pseudo-apology was carefully constructed to accept minimal responsibility while emphasizing her loving intentions and my apparent overreaction to her helpful gesture. She concluded by expressing hope that we could put this unfortunate misunderstanding behind us and return to our normal relationship, clearly expecting that her partial acknowledgement of wrongdoing would be sufficient to restore our previous dynamic. My response, influenced by my recent therapy sessions and growing awareness of our dysfunctional patterns, was different from anything I had offered before. Instead of accepting her non-apology and moving forward as though nothing had happened, I maintained my position that making medical appointments for me without permission was inappropriate, regardless of her intentions. I also expressed appreciation for her concern, while insisting that future expressions of that concern needed to respect my autonomy as an adult. The conversation that followed revealed the extent to which my mother's identity was wrapped up in her role as my caretaker and the depth of her resistance to any redefinition of our relationship. Her genuine confusion about why I would want to handle my own medical care, combined with her hurt feelings about my rejection of her involvement, painted a picture of someone whose entire sense of purpose was threatened by my growing independence. When the call ended with no clear resolution and my mother's obvious disappointment in my refusal to return to our previous dynamic, I realized that the process of establishing healthy boundaries would be far more complex and emotionally difficult than I had anticipated. The relief of having professional validation for my concerns was significant, but it came with the daunting recognition that changing our family system would require sustained effort and ongoing conflict with people I loved. The escalation came 3 weeks later, when I returned home from a successful client presentation, to find my mother sitting in my living room with red-rimmed eyes and a manila folder clutched in her hands. She had used her key again, despite our recent conversation about boundaries, but her demeanor suggested this violation was different from her usual helpful interventions. The folder contained printouts from various websites about depression, anxiety disorders, and what she termed oppositional behavior in young adults. Her research had been thorough and alarming. She had compiled articles about how stress could manifest as unreasonable hostility toward family members, how career pressure could create distorted thinking patterns, and how professional counseling was sometimes necessary to help young people recognize when they were pushing away the people who loved them most. The clinical language she had absorbed and repurposed to explain my recent behavior revealed the depth of her inability to consider that our relationship dynamic might actually be problematic. She had also printed several articles about therapy and its potential dangers, focusing on practitioners who allegedly encouraged patients to blame their families for personal problems rather than taking responsibility for their own emotional issues. Her concern about my therapeutic process was presented as loving worry about my mental health, but the subtext was clear. Professional validation of my concerns was a threat to our family system that needed to be neutralized. The conversation that followed was unlike any we had ever had because my mother abandoned her usual passive-aggressive approach in favor of direct confrontation. She accused me of being brainwashed by a therapist who didn't understand our family's loving dynamic. She questioned whether Dr. Hernandez was qualified to assess relationships she had never observed firsthand. Most damaging of all, she suggested, that my newfound boundaries were symptoms of psychological problems rather than healthy development. Her emotional state during this confrontation was genuinely distressing to witness. The composed, controlling woman I had known all my life seemed to be unraveling before my eyes as she struggled to make sense of changes she couldn't control or manipulate. Her tears were real, her confusion appeared authentic, and her fear about losing our close relationship was palpable. Yet her proposed solution remained the same. I should abandon my therapeutic process and return to our previous dynamic. When I attempted to explain what I had learned about healthy boundaries and family systems, she interrupted with increasingly frantic rebuttals. Every concept Dr. Hernandez had introduced was dismissed as psychobabble designed to destroy families. Every boundary I tried to establish was reframed as evidence of my deteriorating mental health. Every attempt to maintain my position was interpreted as confirmation that I was becoming a different person, someone cold and ungrateful who no longer valued family relationships. The most revealing moment came when she demanded to know specific details about my therapy sessions, claiming that as my mother, she had a right to understand what was being said about our family. Her expectation that I should share confidential therapeutic content demonstrated her fundamental inability to recognize me as a separate person with rights to privacy and professional relationships that didn't include her. My refusal to discuss. My therapy sessions triggered an escalation that crossed every boundary we had previously maintained. She accused me of hiding shameful secrets, of participating in a process designed to turn children against their parents, of allowing a stranger to poison my mind against the people who had sacrificed everything for my well-being. Her language became increasingly dramatic as she painted herself as the victim of my therapeutic process, rather than examining whether that process might be addressing legitimate concerns. The confrontation reached its peak when she delivered an ultimatum that revealed the conditional nature of her love. She insisted that I choose between continuing therapy and maintaining our relationship, presenting this as a reasonable request from a concerned parent rather than an attempt to control my access to professional support. Her belief that she could force me to choose between my mental health and her approval demonstrated the depth of her dysfunction more clearly than any previous interaction. My response surprised both of us. Instead of the tearful capitulation she had come to expect, I calmly explained that I would continue my therapeutic process regardless of her feelings about it. I acknowledged her concern while maintaining that my relationship with Dr. Hernandez was private and professional, not subject to her approval or oversight. For the first time in our relationship, I refused to accept responsibility for managing her emotional response to my autonomous decisions. The silence that followed my declaration lasted several long minutes, during which my mother seemed to be processing the reality that her usual tactics were no longer effective. Her expressions cycled through disbelief, anger, hurt, and finally a kind of cold resolve that I had never seen before. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but distant, as if she was talking to a stranger rather than her daughter. She informed me that she was obviously no longer welcome in my life, and that she would respect my apparent desire for independence by removing herself from my daily existence. Her withdrawal would be complete, she explained, including the cessation of our weekly dinners, regular phone calls, and her key-holding privileges. She presented this isolation as giving me what I claimed to want, while simultaneously punishing me for wanting it. Her performance of wounded dignity was masterful, presenting herself as the gracious party who would step aside rather than continue to burden me with her unwanted love and concern. The guilt and manipulation embedded in this gesture were sophisticated, designed to make me feel responsible for destroying our relationship rather than establishing healthy boundaries. Her expectation that I would panic at the prospect of complete separation and beg her to return to our previous dynamic was obvious. When I accepted her withdrawal calmly and expressed hope that some distance might help us both gain perspective on our relationship, her composure finally cracked. The realization that her ultimate threat was being met with relief rather than desperate negotiation seemed to shock her into a new understanding of how fundamentally our dynamic had shifted. Her tears when she left my apartment that evening were unlike any I had seen before, reflecting genuine grief rather than manipulative performance. The weeks that followed her dramatic exit were initially peaceful in ways I hadn't experienced since childhood. My apartment remained organized according to my own preferences. My schedule was determined by my own needs and desires, and my decisions were made without anticipating someone else's emotional response. The relief of existing without constant monitoring and input was profound, but it was accompanied by unexpected grief for the loss of our previous closeness. My father's response to this development was predictably focused on reconciliation without addressing the underlying issues that had created the conflict. He called repeatedly to express concern about the family's fractured state and to suggest various compromises that would restore harmony without requiring my mother to acknowledge her inappropriate behavior. His mediation efforts revealed his continued inability to recognize that maintaining peace by accommodating dysfunction wasn't actually helpful to anyone involved. The pressure from extended family members intensified as news of our estrangement spread through our social network. Aunts and cousins who had observed our relationship from the outside expressed shock that I would reject such a devoted mother over what they perceived as minor disagreements about boundaries. Their intervention attempts were well-intentioned, but demonstrated how family systems often mobilize to resist change, even when that change addresses legitimate problems. Dr. Hernandez helped me understand that this mobilization of family pressure was a predictable response to my boundary-setting efforts. She explained that family members who hadn't directly experienced the dysfunction might genuinely believe that I was overreacting to normal parental concern. More importantly, she helped me recognize that their opinions about my relationship with my mother were irrelevant to my own healing process and mental health needs. During this period of family separation, my professional life continued to thrive in ways that reinforced the validity of my therapeutic work. Without the constant drain of managing my mother's emotional needs and expectations, I had energy to invest in creative projects and relationship building that enhanced my career prospects. The promotion to senior associate that Jennifer Martinez offered during this period felt like validation of my professional competence and personal growth. My social relationships also began to flourish as I discovered the pleasure of friendships that weren't filtered through my mother's approval or disapproval. Colleagues who had previously seemed acquaintance level began developing into genuine friends as I became more authentic and less guarded in my interactions. The realization that I had been unconsciously screening all relationships through the lens of how my mother might respond was both liberating and disturbing. The most significant revelation during this period was my growing awareness of how much energy I had been expending to maintain my mother's emotional equilibrium. Without that constant responsibility, I experienced physical and mental vitality that I hadn't realized I was missing. Sleep came more easily, work felt less stressful, and decision-making became more straightforward when I only had to consider my own needs and values rather than anticipating someone else's reaction. 6 weeks into our estrangement, my mother made her first attempt at reconciliation through a carefully crafted letter that arrived by mail rather than through direct contact. The letter was a masterpiece of manipulation disguised as reflection, acknowledging that she might have been a little too involved in my life while maintaining that her actions had been motivated by pure love and concern for my welfare. Her pseudo-apology included subtle suggestions that my therapy might have given me a distorted perspective on our relationship, and that perhaps some family counseling together might help us both understand each other better. The letter concluded with expressions of love and forgiveness, positioning herself as the generous party willing to overlook my hurtful behavior in service of rebuilding our bond. The letter's tone and content revealed that her understanding of our conflict remained fundamentally unchanged. She still viewed my boundaries as personal rejection rather than healthy development, still believed her behavior had been appropriate despite its impact, and still expected that minimal acknowledgement of wrongdoing would be sufficient to restore our previous dynamic. Her inability to genuinely examine her role in our dysfunction, even after weeks of separation, confirmed everything Dr. Hernandez had warned me about. My response to the letter marked another milestone in my journey toward authentic selfhood. Instead of the lengthy explanation and emotional processing my mother likely expected, I wrote a brief note acknowledging receipt of her letter and expressing willingness to rebuild our relationship based on mutual respect and appropriate boundaries. I made no apologies for my therapeutic process or my boundary-setting efforts, nor did I accept responsibility for the pain she had experienced as a result of my healthy development. The simplicity and directness of my response seemed to shock my mother more than any previous interaction. Her follow-up phone call revealed her confusion about my continued commitment to maintaining boundaries, despite her olive branch gesture. The conversation was brief and ultimately unproductive, ending with her disappointed observation that I had become someone she no longer recognized, someone cold and clinical rather than the warm, loving daughter she had raised. Her inability to recognize that my warmth and love remained intact, simply redirected toward healthier expression, demonstrated the fundamental challenge we faced in rebuilding our relationship. Until she could acknowledge that love didn't require control and that boundaries didn't constitute rejection, we would remain at an impasse that protected my mental health while maintaining our emotional distance. The transformation in my daily life became increasingly apparent as months passed without the constant undercurrent of my mother's emotional demands and expectations. My apartment evolved into a true reflection of my preferences, with artwork I had chosen displayed on walls, painted in colors that appealed to me rather than meeting someone else's standards of appropriateness. The kitchen contained foods I actually enjoyed eating, prepared according to my own schedule and dietary preferences rather than someone else's vision of proper nutrition. Professional opportunities that had previously seemed overwhelming now felt manageable and exciting. Jennifer Martinez offered me the chance to lead a major campaign for a luxury hotel chain, a project that would require extensive travel and creative decision-making. My immediate acceptance of this challenge contrasted sharply with my previous pattern of consulting my mother about career moves and seeking her approval for professional risks. The campaign proved to be a defining moment in my career development, showcasing skills I had been developing but hadn't fully trusted, due to years of subtle undermining disguised as protective concern. The client presentations I delivered were confident and persuasive, my creative concepts were innovative and well-received, and my management of the project timeline demonstrated organizational abilities I hadn't recognized in myself. The success of this campaign led to recognition within the marketing firm and interest from competitors seeking to recruit experienced professionals. For the first time in my adult life, I was making career decisions based entirely on my own assessment of opportunities and challenges rather than managing someone else's anxiety about my choices. The clarity this brought to my decision-making process was remarkable and empowering. My social life expanded in unexpected directions as I discovered friendships that weren't filtered through my mother's opinions about suitable companions. Sarah Chen, a graphic designer I had met through work connections, became a close friend whose creative energy and independent spirit challenged me to explore interests I had suppressed for years. Through Sarah, I met other professionals who shared my love of art galleries, independent films, and weekend hiking trips that would have previously triggered my mother's concerns about safety and appropriate activities for single women. The relationship that developed with Marcus Rivera, a photographer I met at one of Sarah's gallery openings, represented my first romantic involvement that existed entirely outside my family's influence and approval. Marcus was creative, emotionally intelligent, and refreshingly direct in his communication style. His family background included parents who had immigrated from Mexico and built a successful restaurant business while maintaining close but respectful relationships with their adult children. Observing Marcus's family dynamics provided additional perspective on how healthy families could maintain deep emotional connections while respecting individual autonomy. His parents expressed interest in his photography career without attempting to direct his artistic choices. They offered advice when asked, but didn't interpret his independent decision-making as rejection of their wisdom or love. Most importantly, they seemed to derive satisfaction from his happiness and success, rather than requiring his dependence for their own sense of purpose. The contrast between Marcus's family relationships and my own became a source of both insight and sadness. His casual mentions of disagreeing with his parents about various topics without triggering emotional crises highlighted how abnormal my family's conflict avoidance patterns had been. His ability to share personal challenges with his family, while maintaining ultimate responsibility for his own problem-solving, demonstrated a level of emotional maturity that our enmeshed system had prevented me from developing. Dr. Hernandez continued to provide invaluable guidance as I navigated these new relationships and experiences. Our sessions evolved from crisis management focused on immediate family conflicts to deeper exploration of how my childhood experiences had shaped my adult relationship patterns. She helped me recognize how my mother's emotional unpredictability had taught me to prioritize other people's comfort over my own needs, creating patterns of people-pleasing that extended far beyond our family dynamic. The therapeutic work revealed connections between my mother's behavior and my professional tendency to overwork in attempts to prevent any possible criticism or disappointment. My romantic relationships had been similarly influenced by patterns of anticipating partners' needs while suppressing my own preferences to avoid conflict. The recognition that these patterns stemmed from childhood survival strategies rather than personal failings was both liberating and motivating for continued growth. My father's continued attempts at mediation became less frequent, but more desperate as months passed without resolution between my mother and me. His phone calls revealed increasing strain from living with someone whose primary source of identity and purpose had been suddenly removed. He described my mother's depression and social withdrawal with genuine concern, painting a picture of someone who had lost her sense of meaning and direction without her intensive involvement in my life. These conversations tested my resolve to maintain boundaries in the face of obvious family suffering. Dr. Hernandez helped me understand that my mother's depression, while real and concerning, was not my responsibility to cure through submission to her dysfunctional relationship patterns. She explained that enabling someone's unhealthy behavior by accepting it, rather than maintaining appropriate boundaries, ultimately prevented their opportunity for genuine healing and growth. The distinction between compassion and enabling became clearer through our therapeutic exploration. I could feel genuine sympathy for my mother's distress, while recognizing that returning to our previous dynamic would harm both of us by preventing the development of healthier relationship skills. My refusal to sacrifice my mental health to manage her emotional reactions was not cruelty, but rather an act of love that created space for both of us to grow. Christmas approached with unprecedented complexity as I faced the first major holiday season without the elaborate family traditions my mother had orchestrated throughout my life. The absence of her detailed planning and emotional intensity surrounding gift-giving, meal preparation, and social obligations created space for me to consider what holiday celebrations might look like when organized around my own values and preferences rather than someone else's vision of perfect family harmony. Marcus invited me to spend Christmas Eve with his family, an opportunity that would have been impossible during my mother's reign over our holiday traditions. The Rivera family celebration was warm and inclusive, with multiple generations contributing different dishes and sharing stories that spanned decades of family history. The atmosphere was festive but relaxed, with disagreements handled through good-natured teasing rather than emotional crisis management. The contrast between this celebration and my previous Christmas experiences was striking. Children were allowed to be excited and slightly chaotic without constant behavioral correction. Adults engaged in political discussions that included different viewpoints without anyone threatening to leave or becoming emotionally dysregulated. Most remarkably, the focus seemed to be on enjoying each other's company, rather than creating a performance of perfect family unity. My mother's Christmas card arrived 2 days before the holiday, containing a photograph of herself and my father, looking somber and formal rather than the joyful family portraits she had insisted on in previous years. Her handwritten note expressed love and forgiveness, while subtly emphasizing my absence from their celebration and the sadness this had created. The message was carefully crafted to trigger guilt without directly asking me to change my position. My response was brief and kind, expressing appreciation for their love while maintaining my position that healthy relationships required mutual respect for boundaries. I sent a small gift with a note explaining that I hoped we could eventually rebuild our relationship on a foundation of genuine understanding rather than compliance with expectations. The simplicity of this interaction, compared to the elaborate emotional negotiations that had characterized previous holiday seasons, felt both peaceful and melancholy. The new year brought unexpected contact from my mother through a request to meet for coffee, delivered through my father rather than directly. Her message indicated willingness to discuss our relationship difficulties and possible compromises that might allow us to move forward. The tentative tone suggested she had recognized that her previous strategies were ineffective and that some adaptation might be necessary. Dr. Hernandez helped me prepare for this potential meeting by identifying my non-negotiable boundaries and developing strategies for maintaining them under emotional pressure. She emphasized that my mother's request for reconciliation, while potentially positive, might also represent a more sophisticated attempt to restore our previous dynamic through apparent compromise that didn't address fundamental issues. The coffee meeting took place at a neutral location, the same cafe where I had first met with Kyle Miller months earlier during the neighborhood drama that now seemed like ancient history. My mother appeared smaller and more fragile than I remembered, with less attention to her usual perfect grooming, and an uncertainty in her demeanor that was both heartbreaking and encouraging. Her opening statement surprised me with its directness and apparent insight. She acknowledged that her behavior had been intrusive and controlling, admitted that her good intentions didn't justify boundary violations, and expressed genuine remorse for the pain our conflict had caused both of us. The apology seemed authentic rather than manipulative, suggesting that months of separation had created space for reflection she hadn't previously been capable of. However, the conversation revealed that while her understanding had evolved, the fundamental changes necessary for a healthy relationship remained challenging for her to accept. She could intellectually recognize that her behavior had been inappropriate, but her emotional responses to specific boundary discussions indicated that true acceptance would require ongoing work and commitment rather than a single conversation. When I explained that rebuilding our relationship would require consistent respect for my autonomy and privacy, she struggled visibly with the implications of this requirement. Her questions about what this would mean for our communication frequency, her involvement in my life decisions, and her access to information about my daily activities revealed the depth of her attachment to our previous enmeshed dynamic. The why meeting concluded with tentative agreement to begin slowly rebuilding contact, while I maintained clear boundaries about the pace and scope of our reconnection. My mother's disappointment with this measured approach was obvious, but her willingness to accept it, rather than demanding immediate return to intensive involvement, suggested genuine motivation for change rather than mere manipulation. The months that followed brought gradual, carefully monitored contact that tested both of our abilities to maintain new relationship patterns. Phone calls occurred on schedules that worked for both of us rather than her anxiety-driven need for constant connection. Visits were planned in advance and respected my right to decline invitations when other priorities took precedence. Most importantly, my mother began demonstrating ability to hear about my life and decisions without immediately offering unsolicited advice or criticism. The progress was slow and sometimes frustrating for both of us, but it represented genuine movement toward a relationship based on mutual respect rather than control and compliance. My mother's learning to find satisfaction in my happiness rather than requiring my dependence marked a fundamental shift that created space for authentic connection to develop alongside appropriate boundaries. 2 years after that confrontation, in my apartment when my mother called me selfish for having boundaries, I found myself reflecting on the profound transformation that had occurred, not just in our relationship, but in my entire understanding of what love and family actually mean. The journey from that moment of painful clarity to our current relationship had been neither linear nor easy, but it had fundamentally changed both of our lives in ways I could never have anticipated. The most significant realization came during a recent dinner with my parents, our first shared meal in nearly 3 years. My mother had suggested a restaurant rather than insisting on cooking, respecting my preference for neutral territory during our ongoing reconciliation process. Throughout the evening, she asked questions about my work and relationship with Marcus, without immediately offering advice or expressing concern about my choices. When I mentioned considering a job opportunity in Seattle, she listened with genuine interest rather than launching into warnings about the challenges of moving to a new city. The contrast between this interaction and our previous dinner conversations was remarkable. My father, no longer tasked with mediating constant conflict between us, seemed more relaxed and present than I had seen him in years. He shared stories about his own work and retirement plans, topics that had previously been overshadowed by the intensity of managing my mother's emotions around my life choices. The evening felt like spending time with family members, rather than performing roles in a dysfunctional system. Dr. Hernandez had warned me that family healing often involves periods of regression and testing, where old patterns resurface under stress or during significant life changes. This prediction proved accurate when I announced my engagement to Marcus 6 months ago. My mother's initial reaction included elements of her previous controlling behavior, with immediate concerns about wedding planning, guest lists, and timeline. Decisions that would have triggered major conflict during our earlier dynamic. However, the crucial difference was my ability to recognize these patterns immediately and address them directly rather than allowing them to escalate. When she began offering unsolicited opinions about venue choices and suggesting vendors she had researched without being asked, I calmly reminded her that Marcus and I would be making these decisions together and would ask for her input when we wanted it. Her disappointment was visible but brief, and she adjusted her approach without the dramatic emotional crisis that would have accompanied such correction in the past. The wedding planning process became an opportunity for us to practice our new relationship skills in real-world situations that carried emotional significance for both of us. My mother's desire to be involved was understandable and appropriate, but her learning to wait for invitations rather than assuming unlimited access to every decision was an ongoing challenge that required consistent boundary maintenance from me. Marcus proved to be an invaluable ally during this process, having observed our family dynamics with the clarity of an outsider while maintaining compassion for the complexity of our healing journey. His own family's healthy communication patterns provided a model for how we might interact during stressful planning periods, demonstrating that differing opinions could be discussed without emotional warfare or manipulation. The most powerful moment in our relationship transformation occurred during a conversation about my childhood that my mother initiated several months ago. She had been attending individual therapy at Dr. Hernandez's suggestion, working to understand how her own upbringing had contributed to the controlling behaviors that had damaged our relationship. This therapeutic work had given her language to discuss patterns she had previously been unable to recognize or acknowledge. Her apology during that conversation was unlike any previous attempt at reconciliation, because it included specific recognition of how her behavior had affected my development and well-being. She acknowledged that her need to be needed had prevented me from developing confidence in my own decision-making abilities. She recognized that her emotional reactivity to my independence had taught me to prioritize other people's comfort over my own needs. Most importantly, she accepted responsibility for these impacts without expecting forgiveness or immediate restoration of closeness. This conversation marked a turning point in our relationship because it demonstrated her genuine commitment to change rather than mere compliance with my boundary requirements. Her willingness to examine her own psychological patterns and make difficult changes in her approach to relationships showed respect for me as a person rather than just accommodation of my demands as her daughter. My father's role in our family. Healing has been more subtle but equally important. His recognition that his conflict avoidance had enabled my mother's controlling behavior led him to begin addressing issues directly, rather than hoping they would resolve themselves. His support for my boundary-setting efforts, while initially reluctant, became more genuine as he witnessed the positive changes in our family dynamic. The relationship Marcus and I have built serves as a daily reminder of how different intimate Connections can be when they're based on mutual respect rather than control and compliance. Our disagreements are opportunities for understanding each other better rather than threats to the relationship's stability. Our individual growth and independence strengthen rather than threaten our bond. His support for my career ambitions and personal goals comes without strings attached or subtle attempts to influence my decisions. The Seattle job opportunity I mentioned to my parents represents exactly the kind of major life decision that would have triggered family crisis during our previous dynamic. The position offers significant professional advancement and creative challenges that align perfectly with my career goals, but it would require relocating across the country and limiting our in-person contact to occasional visits and holidays. My mother's response to this possibility has been perhaps the clearest indicator of how fundamentally our relationship has changed. While she expressed sadness about the potential distance, she also expressed pride in my professional success and excitement about the opportunities the position would provide. Her ability to separate her own preferences from my needs, to feel multiple emotions simultaneously without becoming overwhelmed, and to support my decision even when it doesn't align with her desires demonstrates growth I wouldn't have thought possible 3 years ago. The decision about whether to accept the Seattle position has been entirely mine to make, with input from Marcus as my life partner, but without pressure from family members to prioritize their emotional comfort over my professional development. This autonomy in major life decisions feels revolutionary after decades of needing to manage other people's reactions to my choices. Dr. Hernandez and I have begun discussing the conclusion of our therapeutic relationship, recognizing that while I may benefit from periodic check-ins during major life transitions, the intensive work of healing my family relationships and developing healthy boundary skills has been largely completed. The tools I've learned for recognizing and addressing dysfunction in relationships have become integrated into my daily life, informing not just family interactions, but friendships, romantic relationships, and professional connections. The most profound lesson from this entire experience has been understanding the difference between love that supports growth and attention that requires compliance. Real love, I've discovered, involves wanting the best for someone even when that best doesn't align with your own preferences or needs. It means respecting another person's autonomy, even when their independent choices create inconvenience or disappointment for you. My mother's journey toward this understanding has been painful and difficult, requiring her to question fundamental assumptions about parenting and relationships that had guided her behavior for decades. Her willingness to undertake this challenging work, despite the discomfort it caused her, has been the foundation for rebuilding trust and connection between us. The transformation hasn't been limited to our family relationships. My professional confidence has grown exponentially as I've learned to trust my own judgment and abilities rather than constantly seeking external validation. The creative risks I've taken in my marketing campaigns have led to recognition within the industry and opportunities I wouldn't have pursued when I was focused on avoiding any possibility of criticism or failure. My friendships have deepened as I've become more authentic in my interactions, sharing genuine thoughts and feelings rather than carefully curated versions of myself designed to avoid conflict or disapproval. The energy I previously spent managing other people's emotions is now available for pursuing interests, developing skills, and building relationships that bring me joy and fulfillment. Marcus and I are planning a life together that reflects both of our values and goals, rather than compromising our individual identities to create artificial harmony. Our engagement has been a celebration of choosing each other while maintaining our separate selves, a concept that would have been foreign to me before my therapeutic work revealed the possibility of intimate relationships without enmeshment. The wedding itself will be a reflection of our values rather than anyone else's vision of what such celebrations should include. My mother's input has been welcomed when requested and graciously offered when appropriate, but the final decisions belong to Marcus and me as the people whose life together is being celebrated. Looking back on that moment 2 years ago when my mother called me selfish for wanting boundaries, I recognize it as the catalyst for changes that have improved every aspect of my life. The accusation that felt so devastating at the time was actually a gift, forcing me to examine whether my needs were indeed unreasonable or whether the family system that labeled them as selfish was itself problematic. The validation I received from Dr. Hernandez wasn't just professional confirmation that my perceptions were accurate. It was permission to trust my own experience and prioritize my own well-being without guilt or apology. That permission transformed not just my relationship with my mother, but my entire approach to navigating the world as an autonomous adult, capable of making decisions about my own life. For anyone watching this story who recognizes elements of their own family relationships, I want to emphasize that seeking professional guidance isn't betrayal of your family or evidence of personal weakness. Sometimes we need objective perspective to understand whether the patterns we've accepted as normal are actually healthy and sustainable. Setting boundaries isn't selfish. It's necessary for building relationships based on mutual respect rather than control and compliance. The people who truly love you will eventually respect your autonomy, even if they initially struggle with the changes boundary setting requires. Those who continue to label your needs as selfish may be revealing their own inability to love without controlling, which is information worth having as you decide how to structure your relationships going forward. The journey toward healthy family relationships isn't always linear or easy, but it's worth undertaking for the peace and authenticity it ultimately provides. My mother and I still have work to do, boundaries to maintain and patterns to resist, but we now have a foundation of mutual respect that makes continued growth possible. The accusation of selfishness that once caused me such pain has become a reminder of how far we've both traveled toward understanding what love actually looks like when it's not confused with control. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.